Project Echo, The Omega Chronicles. Chapter 1, The August 27th Protocol. The end of the old world did not announce itself with a trumpet blast or the cinematic flash of a nuclear horizon. It began as a series of glitches, undetectable, atmospheric, and profoundly misunderstood. For weeks leading up to the fall, the global medical community had been chasing ghosts, a bizarre spike in spontaneous aggressive psychosis and unexplainable post-mortem muscular twitching. It was a phenomenon that defied the laws of biology, a dormant, primordial sequence within the human genome that had been triggered by an unknown catalyst. At first, it was dismissed as a localized neurotoxin or a strain of hyperrabies. By the time the world realized that the twitching was actually a full reanimation of the brainstem, the transition from a medical curiosity to an unmanageable catastrophe was complete. The turning was happening in hospitals, in homes, and in the middle of crowded streets, turning neighbors into mindless carnivores before a single quarantine could be established. Deep beneath the granite roots of the Black Hills in South Dakota, the silence was absolute, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the binary cycle geothermal plant. The plant was a masterpiece of subterranean engineering, a steel beast that drew the literal heat of the Earth's core to boil working fluid and spin massive, house-sized turbines. Above the plant sat the Matson Aquifer, a prehistoric sea of ice-cold water trapped in the rock, tapped by stainless steel arteries that provided the bunker with its lifeblood. David, a 24-year-old corporal in the Army's 4th Security Detail, stood at the primary blast door of Sublevel 1. His boots were polished to a mirror finish, a habit of a world that was currently dissolving. He adjusted the strap of his M4 carbine, feeling the slickness of sweat on his palms. In the security hub behind him, the monitors were a mosaic of chaos. Level 4 alert has been upgraded, General Vance's voice echoed through the comms. He sounded older than he had that morning. All personnel, initiate the August 27th protocol. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. David looked at the main external feed. The camera, mounted on a high ridge overlooking the valley, showed a world on fire. Far in the distance, I-90 was a ribbon of smoke and wreckage. The GPS tracking pings for the extraction convoys were flickering out one by one. Convoy 1 is dark, the comms officer, a woman named Miller, said with a trembling voice. Convoy 2. Lost signal at the Rapid City perimeter. They're reporting a breach in the armored glass. Sir, the drivers are losing control of the vehicles. Project Echo had been designed for 2,000 essential personnel, the cognitive elite of the United States. Cabinet members, lead scientists from the CDC, structural engineers, and their families. They were the genetic and intellectual seed for a new civilization. But the unknown virus was a biological anomaly that defied every tactical manual ever written. It didn't wait for the military to secure its assets. At 15:30, a series of muffled explosions vibrated through the rock. Convoy 5, the last hope for a full bunker, appeared on the horizon. David watched the monitor as 4 armored buses and 3 Humvees roared up the winding mountain road, pursued by a literal tide of the dead. Thousands of infected civilians, people who had been shopping, working, and living just hours before, were now a mindless, terrifying, high-speed walking mass of gray-skinned hunger. They're coming in hot, Miller screamed. Gateway 1 opening now. David felt the floor shake as the 50-ton hydraulic blast doors began to open. The massive steel slabs moved with agonizing slowness. Through the narrowing gap, David could see the lead bus screaming toward the entrance. Suddenly, the bus swerved. A turning had occurred inside the cramped, armored cabin. The bus flipped, sliding on its side and erupting into a fireball that blocked the primary ramp. The doors! Close the doors! Vance roared over the intercom. Wait! David shouted, stepping toward the monitor. There are people in the second bus. They're getting out. Through the smoke, David saw a woman in a white lab coat, Dr. Eris's wife, though he didn't know it yet, clutching a 6-year-old child. She was sprinting for her life, her movements frantic and human. Behind her, the tide of infected didn't need to sprint. They just kept that steady, fast walk pace, their boots rhythmically hitting the pavement like a drumbeat of inevitable death. They were less than 50 yards away. Corporal, that is a direct order. Seal the facility. David's hand hovered over the override switch. His training screamed at him to obey, but his humanity begged him to wait. He saw the woman's hand reach out, her fingers just inches from the cooling shadow of the bunker's entrance. Behind her, a biter, a man wearing a tattered South Dakota jersey lunged, his teeth baring. Seal it. Vance's voice was a thunderclap. David slammed the switch. The hydraulic hiss turned into a roar as the doors reversed direction. The woman's eyes met the camera lens for a fraction of a second, a look of pleading that would haunt David for the next 30 years, before the steel plates met with a bone-jarring thud. The sound of the lock bolts engaging echoed through the entry hall like a series of gunshots. David stood in the flickering LED light, the silence of the bunker now more terrifying than the noise of the world. He leaned his forehead against the cold steel of the door. From the other side, he heard it, the muffled, frantic thumping of fists. And then the thumping stopped, replaced by the wet, rhythmic sound of tearing flesh and the high-pitched, inhuman shrieks of the infected. Miller slumped over her console, sobbing into her hands. David didn't move. He looked at the manifest on the glowing screen. 2,000 planned occupants. 532 present. The 1,468 empty seats weren't just a failure of logistics. They were a death sentence for the expertise the bunker was supposed to house. The historians, the poets, the agronomists, and half the medical staff were gone. The remaining 532 were the lucky ones, ghosts living in a steel tomb, waiting for a world that would never be the same. Protocol complete. Vance's voice came over the speaker, now devoid of emotion. Welcome to the new America. Population, 532. Total lockdown in effect. No one goes out. Nothing comes in. David walked away from the door, his boots echoing in the hollow hall. He didn't know then that he wouldn't breathe fresh air again for 3 decades. He didn't know that the little boy who hadn't made it through the door was only the first of millions. He just knew that the world was gone, and the Black Hills were now a tomb of granite and steel. The first 5 years of the apocalyptic era, the period survivors now call the Great Thinning, were defined by a total, violent collapse of the social contract. When 80% of the world's population was erased in 60 months, the vacuum was filled by something much darker than mere anarchy. For the outsiders, those who weren't tucked away in billion-dollar holes like Project Echo, life was a frantic, daily negotiation with death. The initial 18 months were the deadliest. This was the period of the undetectable phenomenon, where reanimation was still being treated as a medical emergency rather than a biological apocalypse. The choke points. Governments attempted to create safe zones in city centers, drawing millions of terrified civilians into high-density areas. These became meat grinders. A single undetected turn in a refugee center would trigger a cascade. Within hours, a protected stadium would become a tomb. The grid collapsed. By the end of year one, the last technicians had either died or fled. The power grids flickered out, the internet went dark, and the water systems became stagnant breeding grounds for the rot. For an outsider, the loss of light was the true beginning of the end. The night belonged entirely to the mindless carnivores. By the second year, the roving phase began. The survivors had learned the hard lessons. Cities were death traps, and noise was a death sentence. As the remaining 20% of humanity scattered, they organized into three distinct types of surface cultures. 1. The scavenger gangs, the wolves. These were the groups like the early cowboys. They lived on the momentum of the old world's remains. They didn't plant crops or build filters, they raided. They used mountain bikes and horses because combustion engines were dinner bells for biters. Live for the day. They believed the world was truly over and spent their time hoarding canned goods, ammunition, and fuel. They were the primary reason solitary survivors stayed in the dead zones. It was safer to hide among biters than to be found by a scavenger gang. 2. The neo-feudal factions, the walls. In the rural Midwest and the mountain ranges, larger groups began to settle. They fortified old prisons, shopping malls, or gated communities. These were proto-societies. They brought back work-for-protection systems. If you could weld, farm, or fight, you were given a cot and a bowl of thin stew. These factions were often led by strongmen, former police chiefs, military deserters, or charismatic psychopaths. Personal freedom was traded for the safety of a wall. This is where the first trade wars began, as factions fought over the remaining silos of grain and stockpiles of medicine. 3. The ghost survivors, the shadows. These were the individualists and small family units who refused to join gangs or factions. They lived in attics, crawl spaces, or nomadic tents. They learned to move without sound, to cook without smoke, and to communicate through tree knocking or silent hand signals. This was the loneliest existence. For a ghost survivor, seeing another human was more terrifying than seeing a biter. A biter just wanted to eat. A human wanted your shoes, your knife, and your life. During these first 5 years, the unknown virus was at its most aggressive. The biters weren't yet the moss-covered anchors. They were fresh, strong, and persistent. The world smelled of 2 things: copper, blood, and ozone, the static of a dying electrical world. The sky, without the industrial output of 8 billion people, became a terrifyingly deep blue, and the stars became so bright they felt intrusive. The lost 80% statistics. 60% loss occurred in the first 90 days due to the initial outbreak and the collapse of the medical system. 20% loss occurred over the following 4 years due to secondary killers, starvation, lack of clean water, cholera and dysentery, and the brutal faction wars. By the end of year 5, the world was quiet. The great migrations had stopped. The highways were parking lots of rusted steel. The survivors had stopped looking at the sky for a rescue plane and started looking at the ground for a place to hide. It was into this world of silence and surface saints that the first whispers of a bunker in the hills began to drift, like smoke from a fire no one was supposed to see. Chapter 2. The Steel Hive. While the surface world was being ground into dust, the interior of Project Echo during year 1 was a different kind of nightmare, a psychological pressure cooker fueled by a total lack of information and a desperate, lingering hope that the plan was still in motion. The waiting for the green period. For the first 6 months, the 532 residents didn't believe the world was over. The prevailing theory among the civilian specialists, the engineers and doctors, was that they were in a contained biological event. They assumed the U.S. military was currently executing a burn and sanitize protocol on the surface. The observation void. Because the bunker was designed for total stealth, there were very few external sensors. The residents spent their days staring at the ghost feed's low-resolution, thermal-only cameras that showed heat signatures in the distance. When the heat signatures of the cities began to fade and the lights of I-90 went dark, the technicians argued it was a tactical blackout, not a total collapse. The empty chairs. The most haunting part of the first year was the space. The bunker was built for 2,000 people. There were entire residential wings, mess halls, and gyms that were completely empty. The echoes in the hallways were a constant reminder of the 1,468 colleagues and family members who hadn't made it. The protocol of silence. General Vance and the security detail, including a young, bewildered David, kept a tight lid on the truth. They had access to the classified satellite bursts until the bird links failed in month 4. They knew the meat grinder events were happening, but they didn't share it. The hope lie every Sunday, Vance would broadcast a status update over the bunker's intercom. He used military jargon to obscure the truth. Containment protocols are ongoing. Recovery efforts are being coordinated at the regional level. Remain at your stations. The ration paradox. People couldn't understand why they were on maintenance rations 1,800 calories of soy paste when the bunker's cold storage was supposedly stocked for 2,000 people for 10 years. If there are only 500 of us, why are we starving? Was the most common graffiti in the latrines. The reality was that the life-paced machines were failing even then, and the council was already hoarding for a future that lasted decades, not months. By month 8, the confusion turned into a localized mutiny. A group of 13 engineers, led by a man whose wife and children were in Rapid City, convinced themselves that the government was waiting for them to emerge and help rebuild the power grid. They believed they were being held prisoner by a military coup, not protected from a virus. The radio is silent because they're busy, not because they're dead, they argued during a confrontation in the motor pool. They attempted to override the primary blast door hydraulics. David was forced to lead the security intervention. He didn't use bullets, not yet, but the sight of soldiers in gas masks pointing rifles at their own scientists broke the spirit of the bunker. It was the first time the residents realized that the security detail was there to keep them in as much as it was to keep the dead out. The final blow to the bunker's denial came on December 24, 2010. The last automated dead-hand signal from the Strategic Command Center in Omaha stopped. For months, that rhythmic ping had been the bunker's heartbeat. When it turned to flat, white noise, the senior scientists, men like a younger Dr. Eris, finally understood. The undetectable phenomenon wasn't a riot or a war, it was a biological reset. There was no green light coming. There was no recovery team on the way. The 532 people in the hole weren't the essential personnel for a government. They were the final museum of the human race. By the end of year 1, the civilian mindset died. The residents stopped asking when they were leaving and started asking how they could survive. The empty hallways were sealed off to save on heating. The loom cycle was dimmed to simulate a permanent twilight. The bunker became a steel hive, cold, efficient, and deeply, profoundly depressed. The first anniversary of the descent, August 27th, 2011, marked the official death of the Old World's calendar. In the years that followed, it would be known as Shadow Day, but that first year, it was simply a collective mourning. The atmosphere in the bunker was thick with the scent of ozone and the yeasty, bland aroma of the first life-paced harvest. The residents had spent 365 days in a state of suspended animation, their eyes constantly darting toward the bulkhead clocks, waiting for an all-clear that never echoed through the vents. The High Council authorized a one-hour assembly in the main mess hall, a space designed to seat 800 people that felt cavernous and cold with only the 532 survivors. To honor those who didn't make it, the residents participated in a silent ritual. They took the 1,468 unoccupied chairs from the sealed residential wings and arranged them in perfect, haunting rows in the center of the hall. Each chair represented a colleague, a spouse, a child, or a friend who was supposed to be there. General Vance stood at the podium, but he didn't give a military speech. He simply read a list of the departments that were now skeleton crews. The survivors looked different than they had a year ago. Their skin was sallow from the lack of vitamin D. Their clothes, though clean, hung loosely on frames thinned by maintenance rations. The steel hive was already carving its mark into their bodies. The ceremony ended when a young technician placed a single, hand-drawn picture of a sunflower on the chair that was meant for his wife. Within minutes, the empty chairs were covered in small tokens, wedding rings, photos, and handwritten letters that would never be delivered. While the mess hall was a tomb of memory, the medical bay on level 3 was a theater of desperate hope. Just as the memorial service concluded, the bunker's intercom crackled, not with a military order, but with the thin, sharp cry of a newborn. Isaac was born to Sarah and Thomas, two agricultural scientists who had made it into the bunker by a margin of only 4 minutes. Isaac was the first human in history to be born into a world where the sun was a myth and the horizon was a steel wall. The medical staff, led by Dr. Eris, celebrated the birth as a biological victory. However, the birth also triggered a grim calculation. General Vance and the council realized that every new mouth was a drain on the Matson aquifer and the life-paced vats. As the anniversary ended, the reality of their situation became absolute. The breakout faction had been silenced, and the waiting for the green period was over. David, stationed at the sub-level 1 security post, watched the Shadow Day sunset on the thermal monitors. The Black Hills were cold, the heat signatures of the elk and deer few and far between. There were no lights from Rapid City, just the occasional, slow-moving heat bloom of a fresh spider wandering the pines. He turned his back on the monitors and looked at the long, dimly lit tunnel leading deeper into the earth. The confusion of the first year had been replaced by a heavy, cold clarity. They were the last 532. As the clocks hit midnight, signaling the start of year 2, the loom cycle dipped to its lowest setting. The bunker didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a submarine at the bottom of a dark, infinite ocean. The mission was no longer recovery. It was vigil. The first 5 years inside Project Echo were not a struggle for survival. The machines handled that, but a war against the crushing weight of the mundane. The bunker was a marvel of pre-collapse engineering, 3 miles of tiered tunnels carved into the Precambrian granite. But to the 500 souls trapped inside, it quickly became a steel hive, a place where every breath was recycled, every meal was a processed paste, and every face was a reminder of the 2 billion they had left behind. Life was regulated by the loom cycle. At 6 o'clock, the overhead LED panels would slowly transition from a deep, artificial indigo to a harsh, sterile white, simulating a sunrise that no one would actually see. The humming of the binary cycled geothermal turbines on sublevel 8 was the only constant, a low-frequency vibration that lived in the marrow of their bones. If that sound ever stopped, they were dead. If the heat from the Earth's core ever failed to spin those turbines, the air scrubbers would fail, the water pumps for the Madison aquifer would seize, and the lights would go out forever. David, promoted to sergeant in the first year out of a grim necessity to maintain order, became the face of the bunker's enforcement. His job was no longer to protect the elite from the outside, but to protect the survivors from themselves. Cabin fever isn't a joke, David, General Vance told him during a patrol of the residential tier. It's a contagion. If one person snaps, the whole hive feels the vibration. The early socializing was desperate and forced. In the Commons, a cavernous hall that was supposed to be a grand dining room for 2,000, the survivors gathered to cling to the old world. They held Sim Sundays, where they would project high-definition footage of the Black Hills on the granite walls. They would sit in folding chairs, eating synthesized protein bars, and watch the wind blow through trees that had likely been burned to ash years ago. It was during one of these gatherings in October 2012 that the illusion of safety was finally, bloodily shattered. The community had gathered for the Harvest Festival, a pathetic name for the first successful harvest of hydroponic tomatoes. Dr. Henderson, a grandfatherly structural engineer who had become a pillar of the community, stood up to give a toast with a plastic cup of recycled water. He smiled, opened his mouth to speak, and then his eyes rolled back. He collapsed before he could utter a word, a massive, silent stroke. The room erupted. When Henderson hit the floor, the Sim Sunday piece shattered into 100 jagged pieces. People didn't back away, they surged forward. In the steel hive, every life was precious, and the sight of a pillar like Henderson collapsing triggered a desperate, collective instinct to save him. "Clear the way. Give him air," someone shouted. David was 10 feet away, using his shoulders to wedge a path through the throng of scientists and engineers who were crowding in, their faces pale with concern. It was a chaotic huddle of humanity. An intern was on her knees, performing frantic chest compressions, while a medic barked for a defibrillator that was still 3 levels away. No one was looking for a threat. No one was watching for the twitch. They were too busy being neighbors, distracted by the very empathy that the virus was about to exploit. 3 minutes of frantic, overlapping voices followed. The intern was sweating, her hands locked over Henderson's heart, counting aloud. The crowd pressed closer, peering over shoulders, whispering prayers, unaware that the biological clock had already reset. Beneath the skin, the genomic parasite was working in the silence of his dead veins, rewriting the nervous system with a terrifying, singular purpose. The intern paused to check for a pulse. In that split second of hopeful quiet, Henderson's eyes snapped open. There was no transition, no groan, no warning. He didn't rise like a man in pain. He moved like a spring-loaded trap. With that relentless, high-speed efficiency, Henderson's hand clamped onto the intern's wrist. Before the smile of relief could even form on her face, he lunged. His teeth sank into her throat with a sickening, wet crunch. The transition from a medical emergency to a slaughterhouse happened in a heartbeat. Because they were all crowded so tightly around him, there was nowhere to run. The steel hive became a mosh pit of gore. People trampled one another in the confined space, their screams echoing off the granite walls as Henderson, and seconds later, his first victim, moved through the dense pack of bodies with that driving, mechanical gait. David drew his sidearm, his vision tunneling. He had practiced for breaches and external threats, but his mind recoiled at the sight of the mess hall floor slick with harvest, tomatoes, and human blood. He saw the intern rise, her movements already mimicking Henderson's rhythmic, purposeful walk. Crack. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the acoustic chamber. Henderson's head snapped back, and he slumped into a pile of harvest tomatoes. David stood there, the smoke rising from his barrel, as the screams of the dying filled the air. 30 people died that night. 30 empty seats added to the 1,500. The next morning, the Sololock mandate was issued. No more communal meals. No more festivals. Every residential door was fitted with a heavy-duty magnetic bolt that engaged at 2,200 hours and didn't release until 6 o'clock. The hive had become a series of individual cells. From this trauma, the steel-born generation emerged. Mark was born 6 months after the Henderson massacre. To Mark, the bunker wasn't a prison. It was the entire universe. He grew up in the School of Shadows, a tiered classroom where the children were taught that the surface was a literal hell. Education was not about enlightenment, it was about utility. By age 5, Mark was taught to read by deciphering chemical warnings on equipment. By age 10, while children of the old world would have been playing baseball, Mark was in the labs on Sublevel 4, learning the precise anatomy of a biter. "Look here, Mark," Dr. Eris would say, his voice cold as the steel table they stood over. Eris had lost his wife and child at the door in 2010. He was a man who lived only for the cold comfort of a microscope. He pointed a scalpel at the base of a preserved biter's skull. The cerebral displacement point. The virus reanimates the brain stem and the motor cortex. It ignores the frontal lobe. It ignores the soul. If you don't sever this junction, it doesn't matter how many times you heart-shoot it. It stays hungry. Mark excelled. He was a creature of the fluorescent lights, a boy who found beauty in the geometric perfection of a viral protein shell. He and the other interns were the lifeblood, the hope that science could eventually outpace the decay. But social life was a sterile, monitored thing. Mark's playdates were supervised sessions in the gym deck, where the children were screened for heart murmurs or any sign of physical weakness. The stillborn grew up with a profound sense of bunker guilt. They were the lucky ones, the protected ones, while the world above had rotted. This guilt manifested as an obsessive drive to work. By the time Mark reached his 20s, he was spending 18 hours a day in the lab, driven by a desperate, unspoken need to justify the air he was breathing, air that had been scrubbed 1,000,000 times, air that tasted of the end of the world. David, now the lead recon scout, would watch the boy through the lab glass. He saw the same fire in Mark's eyes that he had seen in the eyes of the soldiers who had died at the gates. It was the fire of a man who was tired of being a ghost. "He's too focused, Eris," David said one evening, standing in the doorway of the lab. "The boy needs to breathe." "There is nowhere out there to breathe," David, Eris replied without looking up. "There is only the science. The science is the only thing that won't turn on us in the dark." Chapter 3. The Anchor. By the year 2040, the steel hive had settled into a state of permanent decay. The geothermal turbines on sublevel 8 were beginning to whine with a mechanical fatigue that no amount of recycled lubricant could fix. Inside the labs, the mood was even more precarious. Mark, now 28, had become the premier mind of the steel-born generation, a man who thought in sequences of base pairs and neural pathways. He worked in the shadow of Dr. Eris, whose cynicism had curdled into a form of scientific nihilism. Eris no longer sought a cure. He sought an explanation for why the human race deserved to end. He spent his days cataloging cerebral displacement points, CDPs, mapping the exact millisecond a human brain flickered from consciousness to predatory instinct. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Eris whispered one morning, pointing to a high-resolution scan of a biter's brain stem. "The virus is the ultimate minimalist. It strips away the ego, the art, the love, the things that make us weak, and leaves only the hunger. It's the perfect survivor." Mark didn't answer. He was staring at a biological sample brought in by David's recon team the night before. David, now a man in his mid-50s with a face that looked like it had been carved from the very granite of the Black Hills, had led a ghost patrol 3 miles past the primary vent. "We found something different near the old park boundary," David told them, his voice gravelly from years of breathing filtered oxygen and tactical smoke. "We call it an anchor." It was a biter that had been pinned against a ponderosa pine by a massive ridgeslide in the early days of 2010. For 30 years, the tree had done something impossible. It had grown around the creature. The bark had fused with the necrotic skin, and the tree's vascular system had intertwined with the biter's nervous system. From the creature's chest, a strange, bioluminescent fungus had erupted, pulsing with a faint, ghostly blue light in the darkness of the lab. "Look at the cellular interface," Mark whispered, leaning into the microscope. "The fungus isn't just growing on it. It's feeding on the unknown virus. It's using the virus's protein shell as a substrate." "It's a mutation," Mark Eris snapped, barely glancing at the slide. "A curiosity of decay. It's what happens when nature tries to reclaim a mistake. It doesn't change the CDP data. Catalog the fungal species and incinerate the sample." Mark felt a hot flash of defiance, a rare emotion in the sterile bunker. This curiosity is doing what we haven't been able to do in 30 years. It's neutralizing the viral load in the host tissue. "Neutralizing?" Eris laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "It's eating it, boy. There's a difference. Now, destroy it. We have 3 more autopsies before the loom cycle resets." Chapter 4: The Secret Favor. That night, for the first time in his life, Mark broke the solo lock mandate. He didn't leave his room after 2,200 hours, but he didn't sleep. He spent the night in the shadows of the lab, having bypassed the magnetic lock using a diagnostic override he'd spent months perfecting. He wasn't destroying the anchor sample. He was experimenting. In a moment of sheer scientific intuition, or perhaps divine accident, Mark knocked a small container of Saccharomyces boulardii into the petri dish containing the anchor fungus. The yeast was a standard probiotic the bunker produced in massive quantities to combat the chronic digestive issues caused by their synthetic diet. Mark froze, expecting the sample to bubble over or trigger a biohazard alarm. Instead, he watched the monitor in stunned silence. The yeast, a common probiotic, began to undergo a horizontal gene transfer with the anchor fungus. The 2 organisms fused, creating a predatory probiotic. Under the 400x magnification, Mark watched as the new yeast strain, which he mentally dubbed Omega, began to unzip the unknown virus's protein shell. It wasn't just eating it, it was dismantling the virus's ability to replicate. It was a proteolytic cascade. My God, he breathed. It's a fungicide for the soul. He knew Eris would never authorize a trial. Eris would see it as a threat to his established end-of-days dogma. Mark needed a field test, and he knew only one person with the courage and the lack of oversight to do it. At 3 o'clock, Mark moved through the geothermal maintenance tunnels, the veins of the bunker where the heat was a sweltering 38 degrees Celsius, and the sound of the turbines masked all movement. He found David in the motor pool, preparing a rover for a dawn recon. David, Mark whispered, emerging from the steam of a pressure valve. David spun, his hand instinctively flying to his sidearm before he recognized the intern. Mark? What the hell are you doing out of your cell? If security catches you. I found something. Eris won't listen. He wants to burn it. Mark pulled a small, unmarked pressurized canister from his lab coat. He'd hand-labeled it with a single black X. What is it? David asked, his eyes narrowing. It's a favor, David. A secret favor between us. I think this kills the fungus on the biters. If you find another anchor, or even a regular biter overgrown with moss, just spray this on it. Tell me if it clears the tissue. Tell me if it makes them easier to see. David looked at the canister, then at the desperate fire in the young man's eyes. He saw the steel-born boy who wanted to believe the world wasn't a lost cause. David took the can and slid it into the side pocket of his tactical vest, right next to his spare magazines. Just the fungus, Mark? David asked. Just the fungus, Mark lied, or perhaps he truly believed it then. Don't tell a soul. Especially not Eris. I was never here, David said, nodding once. Chapter 5. The Ambush at Sector 4. The air on the surface was never truly clear. It was a gritty, alkaline haze that tasted of pulverized concrete and ancient ash. For David, breathing it was a ritual of penance. 48 hours after his secret meeting with Mark, he led a 4-man team into the gray zone, a skeletal remains of a shopping district 6 miles north of the bunker. Eyes up, David whispered into his helmet comms. We're looking for high-value scrap, copper wiring, intact solar cells. And keep a lookout for anchors. Mark wants more samples. The team moved in a diamond formation, their electric rovers parked 2 blocks back to minimize noise. The ruins of a massive pharmacy sat before them, its roof partially collapsed, creating a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. They were inside the pharmacy, David prying open a rusted medical locker, when the silence was shattered. It wasn't the moan of a biter, but the sharp, metallic clack of a bolt-action rifle being cycled. Ambush, David roared, diving behind a row of toppled shelves. A hail of rusted lead chewed into the drywall above his head. Out of the shadows of the pharmacy's mezzanine emerged the cowboys. They were a terrifying evolution of human desperation, men and women dressed in cured biter hide and salvaged riot gear, their mountain bikes modified with spiked tires and silent chains. They didn't want the bunker scrap. They wanted their technology. Drop the packs and the lead, a voice screamed from above. It was Cale, a man whose face was a map of radiation burns and scars. Give us the gear, and you get to walk back to your hole. Not today, David hissed. He popped up, firing a controlled 3-round burst from his carbine that sent the cowboys scrambling for cover. The skirmish was a chaotic symphony of muzzle flashes and shattered glass. David's team began a leapfrog retreat toward the rear exit, but Cale was fast. He dropped from the mezzanine like a predatory cat, slamming into David's back. The two men tumbled into a pile of expired plastic medicine bottles. Cale wasn't trying to kill David yet. He was clawing at the tactical vest, his eyes locked on the high-grade ceramic plates and the specialized tools. In the struggle, Cale's jagged combat knife caught the primary buckle of David's vest. With a sharp snap, the heavy-duty webbing gave way. David, move. The Rovers are hot, his teammates screamed from the alleyway. David saw a dozen more cowboys emerging from the street. He had a choice: stay and fight for his gear, or get his men out alive. He slammed a boot into Cale's chest, creating just enough space to scramble to his feet. Cale rolled away, clutching the stolen tactical vest like a trophy, the secret canister with the black X still tucked into the side pocket. Go! 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 David barked, diving into the moving Rover. As they sped away, David looked back through the rear glass. He saw Cale standing in the middle of the street, holding the vest aloft. David felt a cold knot in his stomach. Chapter 6: The Mystery of the Ghost Dust. Cale didn't keep the vest for long. In the brutal economy of the surface, a bunker vest was worth more than its weight in gold, but its high-visibility tactical profile made it a target for every sniper and scavenger in the Black Hills. Fearing he had poked a sleeping giant, Cale traded the bulk of the gear to a heavily armed traveling caravan in exchange for a crate of clean, pre-collapse ammunition and 3 gallons of stabilized ethanol. However, he kept the weird spray tucked in his waistband. He couldn't figure out the latch, but he figured it was either high-grade concentrated mace or some kind of chemical fire starter, valuable enough to keep, but too mysterious to trade away cheaply. Eventually, through a series of bloody exchanges and desperate barters, the canister fell into the hands of Mara. Mara was a legend among the ruins, a woman who lived in the dead zones where even the cowboys feared to tread. She had traded a precious gallon of scavenged fuel for the can, driven by a gut instinct. She didn't know what was inside, but the weight of it felt like a weapon of last resort. Weeks later, the mystery was solved in a heartbeat. Mara was scavenging in the collapsed basement of a pre-collapse elementary school, her flashlight cutting through the thick, stagnant dust of 30 years. She didn't hear the bloater until it was too late. The biter, swollen with methane gases and the wet rot of 3 decades, lunged from behind a row of rusted lockers. Mara went down hard. She had no room to swing her machete in the cramped, debris-choked crawl space. As the creature's black, oily fingers closed around her throat and its teeth snapped inches from her face, she reached into her pack and grabbed the canister. She didn't look for a nozzle. She simply slammed the metal base of the can directly against the bloater's distended skull with the strength of a dying woman. The vessel ruptured under the massive pressure. A dense, shimmering cloud of white dust exploded in the light of her dropped flashlight. Mara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a chemical burn or a face full of acid. Instead, she witnessed something that defied 30 years of horror. The bloater didn't just stop, it went into a violent, bone-snapping convulsion. The thick fungal mats on its skin turned jet black and withered in seconds, and the creature's milky eyes turned a deep, bruised obsidian. The hunger seemed to be vacuumed out of it. It slumped to the floor, truly and finally dead. Mara leaned against the cold granite wall, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. She looked down at her arm. The wound was a jagged, angry tear, the blood already beginning to darken as it pooled in the white dust of the floor. She knew the protocol. She knew the biology. In a matter of hours, Her mind, her memories of the sun, her knowledge of the labs, her very soul, would be overwritten by that relentless, driving hunger. She reached for the heavy steel scalpel she dropped during the struggle. Her fingers were slick with blood, making the tool feel clumsy and heavy. She pressed the tip of the blade against the pulse of her throat. "Not like this," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dim, metallic air. "I won't be one of them." She closed her eyes, tears carving clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She waited for the courage to lean into the blade, to end it before the turn could begin. The yeasty, ozone-heavy air of the bunker felt thick in her lungs, almost suffocating. But as she sat there in the dark, the expected fever didn't rise. The fire in her veins didn't spread. Instead, a strange, cooling sensation began to crawl upward from her lungs. The substance she had inhaled was moving. It wasn't a virus, it was a predator. It surged through her bloodstream with a cold, blue efficiency, hunting the virus's proteins before they could latch onto her nervous system. Mara's hand began to shake, but not from the tremors of the virus. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the steel pushing down on her, the cold edge of the scalpel still biting into the soft skin of her throat. She had braced herself for the fire, the white-hot neural spike that signaled the end of a human life, but the fire never came. Instead, a profound, icy clarity settled over her. She pulled the blade away, staring at her arm with a mix of horror and disbelief. The jagged wound was there, the blood was real, but the turning had simply stopped. Her eyes darted to the empty, dented canister lying in the dust. She reached out a trembling hand, touching the residue. It felt organic. Confusion surged through her, sharper than the pain of the bite. This wasn't a standard military-grade neutralizer. Whatever was in that can was something special, an unknown biological predator that had hunted the virus in her veins and won. She was saved, but as she sat shivering in the silence, she realized the truth was more terrifying than the death she had prepared for. She hadn't just survived, she had been changed by something she was never supposed to find. She pulled her rucksack tight. She pulled out a battered, hand-cranked shortwave radio. She keyed the mic once and told her story. Within days, the rumors began to hit the shortwave frequencies that the bunker's radio room monitored 24/7. To anyone listening, there is a miracle in the South Sector. They're calling it the ghost dust. Back in the depths of Project Echo, David and Mark sat in the dim, red light of the mess hall, huddled near a clandestine radio receiver they had rigged to bypass the High Council's filters. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and crushing defeat. "They're calling it ghost dust. The scavengers are saying it dropped a bloater in 5 seconds and cured a bite." "A bite, David." David shook his head, his face a mask of bitter confusion. "Whoever made the ghost dust, they must have a real lab. A secret government facility in the East, maybe? Or a rogue CDC bunker with a full staff. Someone out there actually did it. They solved the riddle while we've been down here arguing over oxygen rations and CDP mapping." "Someone else," David said, the words tasting like ash. "The radio is saying it was a gift from a surface saint. The cowboys think it's a weapon from a rival faction." Even Eris heard the reports. He told the council it's a mass hallucination, a collective delusion born from starvation and despair. "But we know it's real," Mark said, his heart sinking. "We can hear the hope in their voices. Someone else saved the world, David. We're just the ghosts in the machine, left behind in a granite tomb while the surface dwellers found the keys to the kingdom." As the weeks passed, the rumors of the ghost dust became the only thing people talked about in the Steel Hive whisper networks. It was the first bit of hope the bunker had felt in decades, but it was a bitter, stinging hope. To the Steelborn, it felt like a final insult that they had spent their entire lives training to be the saviors of humanity, only to find out that they were obsolete. Neither of them realized that Mara was still out there, moving through the ruins toward the Black Hills, guided by the faded military markings on the vest David had left behind. For Mara, time after the rupture of the canister became a blur of silver-white dust and impossible silence. She stayed in that elementary school basement for 3 days, not out of weakness, but out of a paralyzing wait for an end that refused to come. She stared at the jagged tear on her forearm. By all the laws of the last 30 years, she should have been a mindless carnivore within hours. She should have felt the fire, the skyrocketing fever that cooked the human ego until only the hunger remained. But as she sat in the settles of the white powder, the wound didn't putrefy. It didn't turn the sickly shade of bruised plum that signaled the virus taking hold. Instead, it bled clean, then scabbed over with a strange, yeasty resilience. "I'm not turning," she whispered to the empty, dark hallway. Her voice sounded like grinding gravel. She looked at the remains of the canister. It was shredded, the metal peeled back like a flower of jagged steel. Whatever had been inside was gone, but it had left its mark on the floor, a faint, chalky residue that smelled of baked bread and ozone. She realized then that she hadn't just found a weapon, she had found the only cure in existence. And she had used the only dose on herself. Mara gathered her gear, her eyes falling on the tactical vest she had scavenged from the cowboys. She had originally taken it for the ceramic plates, but now she looked at it with the intensity of a scholar. She dragged it under the beam of her flashlight. On the interior lining, stitched in heavy-duty nylon thread that had survived 3 decades of recycled air and surface grit, was a series of markings, property of U.S. Army, Stratcom, Project Echo, SCDT-4. Beneath the text was a stamped coordinate grid and a stylized emblem of a mountain peak with a pulse line running through it. Project Echo, she murmured. She knew the rumors. Every scavenger from the Badlands to the Missouri River spoke of the steel ghosts, soldiers who appeared in silent, electric vehicles, took what they needed, and vanished into the granite. Most surface dwellers thought they were a myth or a collective hallucination of the old government. But the vest in her hands was heavy, real, and smelled of a sterile world she couldn't imagine. Her journey began at the ruins of the pharmacy where the cowboys had first ambushed the ghosts. She moved with a new kind of purpose. She wasn't just scavenging for fuel or canned peaches anymore. She was tracking a god. The trek toward the Black Hills was a 200-mile gauntlet of nightmare. Mara moved through the silent suburbs, where the biters stood like statues in the midday sun, their skin mummified by the dry prairie wind. She used the markings on the vest as a compass. The coordinates pointed toward the highest peaks of the Granite Range, a place the surface dwellers avoided because of the hum, a low-frequency vibration that many thought was the mountain itself mourning the dead. Mara knew better now. That hum wasn't mourning. It was the sound of a heart beating underground. Along the way, she encountered other survivors. In a collapsed gas station near Wall, she met a group of hollow-eyed travelers. They sat around a fire of corn husks, whispering about the ghost dust that had supposedly fallen in the South Sector. "They say a woman breathed it in and didn't turn," an old man muttered, his eyes wide with a religious fervor. "They say she's a saint now." carrying the breath of God in a tin can. Mara sat in the shadows of the corner, her hood pulled low, her gloved hand covering the scar on her arm. She didn't tell them she was the saint. She didn't tell them the breath of God was a mistake smashed against a bloater's head. She simply listened, realizing that the rumor of the dust was spreading faster than she could walk. As she reached the foothills of the Black Hills, the terrain became a vertical labyrinth. The undiscovered nature of the virus meant the woods were thick with anchors, biters fused into the ponderosa pines, their mindless snapping muffled by the overgrowth of moss. On the 14th day, she found it, a hidden ventilation grate disguised as an outcropping of rock. It breathed, a steady, warm updraft of air that smelled of ozone, recycled sweat, and something she hadn't smelled in her entire life, industrial soap. Mara knelt by the grate, clutching the vest to her chest. She looked at the coordinates on the tag, then at the massive granite wall before her. "I found you," she whispered. Mara didn't try to knock. She knew the steel ghosts didn't open their doors for beggars, and she wasn't about to offer herself up as a lab rat. Instead, she found a high, jagged vantage point overlooking the hidden valley where the primary blast doors were concealed. She set up a lean-to beneath a shelf of Precambrian granite, masked by the heavy scent of pine and the gray-green moss of the Black Hills. And then she waited. Days bled into weeks. Mara became a part of the landscape, as silent and unmoving as the trees. She watched the way the shadows moved across the valley floor, noting the precise moments when the perimeter sensors flickered to life. She waited for the electric rover's sleek, silent machines to emerge from the mountain's gut-like beetles, patrolling the service roads before vanishing back into the rock. She documented their patterns. She saw the ghost patrols in their pressurized suits, moving with a stiff, military discipline that felt alien to the lawless surface. She was a woman who had survived a bite, her blood humming with the cold clarity of the white powder, and she had all the time in the world to find the people who had accidentally saved her life. She learned the bunker's rhythm, the venting of the geothermal steam at dawn, the low-frequency vibration of the turbines that she could feel through the soles of her boots. She gathered what she needed: names from overheard radio bursts, the location of the secondary air intakes, and the realization that the people inside were just as trapped as the biters outside. When she finally pulled up her stakes, she did so in the dead of night, leaving no trace but a flattened patch of needles. She melted back into the dead zones, carrying the secrets of the steel hive with her. She would never tell another living soul about the location of the bunker. To the world, it remained a myth. But to Mara, it was a debt. She disappeared into the smoke of the horizon, the ghost dust still clinging to the lining of her pack, a silent witness to a place that officially didn't exist. Chapter 7: The Revelation. 6 months had passed since the loss of the first canister in the pharmacy ambush. Inside the bunker, the ghost dust had transitioned from a frantic radio rumor into a campfire myth, a ghost story the Steelborn whispered to one another in the dark. Dr. Eris had officially classified the reports as mass psychotic projection, a documented phenomenon where desperate surface survivors, broken by 3 decades of trauma, hallucinated a savior or a miracle cure to cope with the looming reality of extinction. Mark listened to those radio reports with a heavy heart, but he never once drew a line between the miracle and his lost fungicide. To him, the ghost dust was a sophisticated weapon from a superior, unidentified laboratory the kind of breakthrough he felt he was too young and too ill-equipped to ever achieve. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in a cycle of frustration and scientific obsession. He couldn't let go of the failure of the first canister. In his mind, David had lost the only tool that could make their scouts safer. Mark spent his nights in a fevered dream of simulations, rerunning the horizontal gene transfer between the Saccharomyces and the anchor fungus. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for a way to perfect his visibility agent. He was haunted by the math of the fungal growth, convinced that if he could just get the concentration right, they could strip the camouflage from every anchor in the Black Hills, turning the invisible threats into clear targets. "I need to know if the visibility theory actually works, David," Mark whispered in the humid darkness of the motor pool. The air was thick with the smell of grease and recycled oxygen. He handed David a second canister, this one professionally machined in the bunker's machine shop under the guise of a high-pressure coolant valve to avoid Eris's scrutiny. It was twice the size of the original, carrying a concentrated payload of the Omega strain. Mark continued, his voice thin with exhaustion. "The scouts are still walking into ambushes because they can't see the biters through the moss. This is just about protection. One test. No ambiguity. Find an anchor, spray it, and tell me if the fungus clears. If it doesn't make the target more visible, I'll burn my notes and never mention the project again." David looked at the young man. Mark's eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles, his skin the color of old parchment from months of avoiding the loom cycle to work in the shadows. David saw the desperation of a scientist who just wanted to prove his work had value. He reached out and took the heavy canister. "One test," David nodded. "I'll find a tree that's overgrown. Let's see if we can finally give the scouts an edge." 3 days later, David's team returned to the anchor site near the park boundary. The ancient biter was still there, fused to the ponderosa pine, its fungal chestplate pulsing with that eerie blue light. David approached it alone. His team held the perimeter, their rifles trained on the tree line. David pulled the canister. He felt the weight of it. Not knowing what to expect, he pressed the nozzle. A jet of fine white mist coated the biter's face and chest. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the reaction began. It wasn't a slow decay, it was a biological explosion. The fungus turned black and liquefied instantly. The biter's jaw unhinged in a silent, bone-cracking spasm. Its milky eyes turned obsidian as the omega yeast surged through its neural pathways, dismantling the protein chains with the efficiency of a demolition crew. The biter went limp. The hunger that had animated the corpse for 3 decades simply evaporated. David froze. He looked at the canister in his hand, then back at the shriveled, exposed skin of the biter. The white powder wasn't just a cleaning agent, it was a revelation. He didn't wait to see if the fungus would regrow. He spun on his heel, signaling his team to move. He didn't run, he didn't need to. He boarded the electric rover. The machine's high-torque motors let out a sharp, predatory whine as he floored the accelerator. The rover tore through the underbrush, bouncing over frozen roots and granite slabs, a silent blur of steel through the pines. David bypassed the standard decontamination protocol, overriding the secondary blast doors with his command code. He surged into the sublevel 4 labs, the rover's tires still hot and smelling of scorched ozone. He slammed the heavy canister onto Mark's metal desk, the sound ringing like a hammer blow through the sterile room. Mark jumped, his sunken eyes wide with shock. "It wasn't a mutation, Mark," David panted, his chest heaving as he stared at the scientist. And it wasn't some miracle from the surface. He pointed a trembling finger at the unmarked canister. The substance, it was us. Eris, overhearing the conversation and realizing that Mark didn't stop on the fungus matter, it's a procedural fluke. Eris screamed, his voice cracking. You've released an unmapped bioagent into the ecosystem. The ecosystem is already dead, Eris. David roared back, slamming his fist onto the table. This is the first time in 30 years we've been the ones doing the killing. Chapter 8. The 2-Year Vigil. The atmosphere in the High Council chamber on the day of the Omega revelation was not one of celebration, but of profound, panicked calculation. The chamber, carved into a natural quartz-veined cavern on sublevel 2, was designed to be the seat of a restored American government. Instead, it had become a boardroom for a dwindling species. The discussion began with a video playback from David's helmet cam. The council, comprising 5 department heads, watched in stunned silence as the visibility agent dissolved a 30-year-old biter in seconds. General Vance, now 80 and clinging to his authority, was the first to speak. This isn't just a tactical advantage, it's a reclamation. If we can clear Sioux Falls, we can access the rail yards. We can reach the other caches. Dr. Eris, however, was the voice of the opposition. He didn't argue against the science, he argued against the cost. We are a closed-loop system, General. Our vats are currently dedicated to life paste, the protein and carbohydrate slurry that keeps 500 people from starving. To mass-produce Mark's predatory yeast, we have to stop producing food. We have to siphon the very oxygen we breathe into the fermentation tanks. The crushing reality of the math. Mark was called to the center of the quartz table to present the siphon projections. The math was cold and terrifying. The scalability gap, they had 1 canister. To clear Sioux Falls using atmospheric dispersal, the balloon method, they needed approximately 25 tons of concentrated, stabilized Omega dust. The oxygen debt, the Omega strain was an aerobic powerhouse. To grow it at that volume, the bunker's air scrubbers would have to be dialed down in the residential sectors to feed the vats. The power drain, keeping 25 tons of biomass at a steady 38 degrees Celsius, the Goldilocks zone for the Omega transfer, would require 40% of the geothermal output, plunging the bunker into a permanent red light energy state. The debate lasted 18 hours. The council was split between the preservationists, who wanted to keep the status quo and stay safe underground, and the reclamationists, who saw this as their only chance before the bunker's machinery eventually failed. We are dying anyway, David argued, his voice echoing off the quartz. Every year the turbines get louder. Every year the aquifer levels drop. We can die slowly in the dark, or we can take a breath of thin air and fight for the surface. The final vote was 3-2. The 2-year vigil was authorized. The decree was simple but brutal. All non-essential lighting and heating to be cut. Rations reduced to the survival minimum 1,200 calories/day. The alpha and beta fermentation wings were to be purged of food yeast and reseeded with the Omega strain. As the council adjourned, the lights in the hallway flickered and dimmed to a dull, emergency crimson. The siphon had begun. The High Council had chosen a path that would either save the world or turn Project Echo into a mass grave within 24 months. The next 2 years became known as the Great Siphon. It was a period of calculated, agonizing hardship that pushed the 500 residents to the edge of mutiny. To grow the Omega yeast at scale, Mark had to commandeer the bunker's primary fermentation vats that were currently used to produce the life paste that fed the residents. Worse, the yeast was an aerobic glutton. It required massive amounts of oxygen. Mark diverted 40% of the bunker's oxygen scrubbers to the Omega tier. For 24 months, the residents lived in a state of perpetual hypoxia. Their lips were perpetually blue, their movements were slow and lethargic. Oxygen fights became common in the commons as people fought for the right to sleep near the ventilation intake. The shift from a sanctuary to a biological factory pushed the residents of Project Echo to a psychological and physiological breaking point. By the 6th month of the 2-year vigil, the atmospheric debt had become a physical weight. To keep the 25 tons of Omega yeast alive and hungry, Mark had been forced to prioritize the airflow to the alpha and beta fermentation wings. In the residential tiers, the oxygen concentration dropped from a crisp 21% to a staggering 14.5%, the equivalent of living at an altitude of 10,000 feet. The stillborn children, already pale from a lifetime underground, began to suffer from chronic hypoxia. The symptoms were everywhere: blue-tinged fingernails, constant throbbing headaches, and a terrifying irritability that turned minor disagreements into violent outbursts. The riot began on a Tuesday during the red shift, the period of lowest power. A primary circulation fan in the level 4 residential block seized due to lack of maintenance. For 3 hours, the air in the most densely populated corridor became stagnant and carbon dioxide heavy. A group of life-paced technicians, exhausted from halved rations and lightheaded from the thin air, gathered outside the Omega tier security doors. They weren't soldiers or rebels. They were parents who had watched their children wake up gasping for air in the middle of the night. "Give us the air," a technician named Elias screamed, hammering a lead pipe against the reinforced glass of the lab. "The yeast doesn't need to breathe more than my daughter." David was dispatched with a security detail to quell the unrest. He arrived to find nearly 50 people trying to pry open the ventilation baffles that fed the fermentation vats. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows, making the gaunt, hypoxic protesters look like the very biters they were trying to defeat. "Stand back," David commanded, his own voice raspy from the thin atmosphere. He didn't raise his rifle. He knew that a single gunshot in this pressurized environment could trigger a catastrophic pressure drop. "You're killing us, Sergeant," Elias shouted, his face flushed a sickly purple from exertion. Eris was right. This isn't a cure, it's a sacrifice. We're suffocating so Mark can grow his ghost dust. The crowd surged. David was pushed back against the lab doors. In the chaos, someone managed to smash the manual override for the intake valves. A deafening hiss filled the corridor as the oxygen meant for the Omega vats began to bleed into the residential hallway. Inside the lab, Mark watched his monitors with horror. "The O2 levels in vats 1 through 6 are plummeting," he yelled over the internal comms. "David, if the yeast goes anaerobic now, it'll produce toxic ethanol. It'll kill everyone on this level." David realized he couldn't reason with people who were literally starving for air. He made a split-second decision. He didn't fight the crowd. He joined them at the valve, but he used his superior strength to jam the lever at the 30% mark, a dangerous compromise. "Listen to me," David bellowed over the hiss of the gas. "I'm locking the valve here. You get your air, but the vats stay alive. If you take it all, the yeast dies, the vats explode, and nobody breathes ever again." The logic of survival, even in a hypoxic fog, took hold. The rioters slumped against the walls, inhaling the rich, cold oxygen-heavy air that smelled faintly of the omega yeast. They wept as their headaches receded. The oxygen riot forced the council to realize that the 2-year vigil couldn't be sustained by force alone. They implemented the pulse-breathing protocol, where oxygen was rotated through the residential sectors in 4-hour bursts, giving the residents just enough relief to keep their cognitive functions intact while the yeast continued its slow, ravenous growth. Mark, feeling the weight of the riot, moved his cot into the residential hallways for a week. He wanted to breathe the same thin air as the people he was asking to sacrifice everything. He realized then that the ghost dust wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a debt that could only be paid by a successful launch. The geothermal plant was pushed to its red line. To keep the omega vats at the precise temperature of 38 degrees Celsius, Mark siphoned power from the residential grid. The LED loom cycle was cut to 4 hours a day. For 20 hours out of every 24, the steel hive lived in a dim, red light energy save mode. The bunker became a place of freezing shadows and the rhythmic, terrifying thrum of the overtaxed turbines. While Mark fought the vats, David fought the surface. He knew that once they launched, they would be vulnerable. He spent 2 years leading long-range recon missions to Sioux Falls, mapping every street, every river of dead, and every cowboy outpost. He discovered that the cowboys had grown into a pseudo-military force. They had identified the ghost dust rumors and were actively searching for the source. David's teams had to move like ghosts, caching supplies and identifying 7 precise launch points, where the thermal updrafts from the city's ruins would carry their balloons into the stratosphere. Mark lived in the lab. He slept in a cot next to the vats, listening to the bubbling of the yeast, the sound of 1,000 tiny hearts beating. He watched as his peers, the stillborn, grew thin and bitter. Dr. Eris became a shadow, a man who refused to leave his quarters, convinced that the Omega Project would eventually mutate and kill them all. "We're killing them to save them," David, Mark said one night, his voice raspy from the thin air. He was looking at the latest ration reports. People were losing hair. Their bones were becoming brittle from the lack of vitamin D and proper nutrition. "We're giving them a reason to be hungry," David replied, sharpening his combat knife in the red light. "For 30 years, we ate because the clock told us to. Now, we're eating because there's a world out there waiting for us. Hang on, Mark. The vats are almost at capacity." In late 2042, the sensors finally turned green. The Omega payload was ready. They had manufactured 50,000 pounds of the predatory yeast, stabilized in a fine, crystalline powder. They had sewed 25 massive polyethylene balloons by hand, using the last of the bunker's industrial plastic. The vigil was over. The war was about to begin. This installment covers the turning point of the war, the moment the Steelborn realized they held the keys to the world, and the brutal cost of turning a bunker into a factory of hope. Chapter 9: Operation Stardust. The Chimney Tests. The Black Hills were honeycombed with natural limestone fissures that the original Project Echo engineers had converted into ventilation chimneys, narrow, vertical shafts that terminated in camouflaged grates on the mountain peaks. In late 2042, David and Mark began the stealth inflation tests. They couldn't simply walk out the front door with a 100-foot balloon. Instead, they used the natural thermal updrafts created by the geothermal plant. The heat from the turbines rose through the chimneys, providing the perfect lift for the polyethylene envelopes. "If the tension is off by even a fraction, the rock will shred the plastic," Mark warned, his eyes fixed on a pressure gauge. He was thinner now, his ribs visible through his jumpsuit, but his hands were steady. They practiced folding and deployment, the art of packing a massive balloon into a compact crate that could be hauled up the shafts by hand. David's scouts, who had regained some strength during the pulse-breathing cycles, spent weeks climbing the interior rungs of the chimneys, clearing out 30 years of bat guano and spiderwebs to ensure a clean launch. The payload stabilization. While the scouts mastered the climb, Mark faced the final hurdle, the clumping problem. The omega yeast, in its concentrated form, was slightly tacky. If it clumped together, it would fall like hail rather than drifting like a veil. To solve this, he used a specialized drying technique involving the Matson aquifer's minerals. By coating the yeast in a microscopic layer of calcium carbonate, he ensured the dust would remain buoyant. "It has to be perfect," Mark said, tapping a vial of the shimmering white powder. "If it doesn't stay in the air for at least 6 hours, the wind won't carry it over the city center. We only get one shot at Sioux Falls." The final council review, Operation Stardust. In the final week of the vigil, the High Council gathered one last time in the dim, red-lit chamber. The report was sobering. Omega stockpile, 25.2 tons, exceeding target. Balloon integrity, 25 units tested and ready. Bunker morale, critical but stable. Geothermal stability, 88% capacity. The turbines were vibrating at a dangerous frequency, but they would hold for the launch. General Vance looked at David. "The cowboys have increased their patrols near the eastern ridge. They know something is happening. They've seen the heat signatures from the chimneys." "Let them watch," David replied, his hand resting on his sidearm. "By the time they realize what we're launching, the wind will have already won." The order was signed. The 2-year vigil was over. The mission, Operation Stardust, was set for the next high-pressure weather system moving across the plains. The residents of Project Echo were given a double ration of life paste and a full hour of 21% oxygen. It was a last supper for the life they had known. The next time those blast doors opened, they wouldn't just be letting air in, they would be letting humanity back out. On the moonless night of April 12, 2043, the great blast doors of Project Echo groaned open for a departure unlike any in the bunker's history. This was no scouting party, it was an exodus of hope. 7 electric rovers, their chassis reinforced with salvaged hull plating and their motors humming with a high-pitched geothermal whine, rolled out into the biting chill of the surface. The steel-born engineers shielded their eyes, even in the moonlight, weeping at the mere sight of a horizon that didn't end in a concrete wall. But there was no time for sentiment. The mission was a logistical nightmare. They were carrying 25 massive, hand-sewn polyethylene balloons and 50,000 pounds of the stabilized Omega payload. "Stay tight," David's voice crackled over the secure frequency. "We have a river of dead 3 miles ahead. If we wake that horde, we lose the launch window." The journey to Sioux Falls was a grueling odyssey. To avoid a massive migratory horde of nearly 10,000 biters clogging the main highway, the convoy had to take a treacherous detour through the Big Sioux drainage. The rovers tilted at dangerous angles, their reinforced tires slipping on moss-covered rebar and ancient, cracked concrete. Mark sat in the lead vehicle, his hands white-knuckled on a payload crate. Every jolt of the suspension felt like a threat to the 2 years of sacrifice the bunker had endured to grow this batch. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, a skeletal forest of rusted skyscrapers, the team was exhausted. They pulled into a derelict stadium, the high concrete walls offering a natural windbreak for the delicate inflation process. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle and the roar of modified, salvaged engines. Contacts. North and east. David roared, diving for cover behind a rover's wheel well. It was the cowboys. They weren't there for the ghost dust. That was a myth from years ago, a story that had faded into the background noise of the wastes. They were there for the rovers. In a world of scrap, 7 functional, high-torque electric vehicles were a king's ransom. They saw the bunker team as a fat prize, well-equipped survivors with clean gear and enough supplies to feed a militia for a year. Drop the keys and the crates. Cale's voice boomed from the stadium rafters. Leave the trucks and walk away, and maybe we don't skin you. Defensive perimeter. Suppressive fire only. David barked. He didn't want a massacre. He wanted the balloons in the air. A fierce skirmish broke out in the dark. The cowboys, riding spiked mountain bikes and a rusted technical truck with a mounted machine gun, circled the stadium like wolves. They laid down a heavy base of fire, thinking they were pinning down a supply convoy. They had no idea they were interrupting the most important scientific launch in human history. Mark, get the burners open. We're running out of time. David screamed, returning fire as a hail of lead chewed into the stadium's turf. Under the cover of the security team's night vision-assisted precision, the engineers worked with trembling hands. They ignited the portable heaters, and the massive balloons began to swell, rising like rising ghosts against the backdrop of the ruins. The cowboys paused, momentarily stunned by the sight of the translucent orbs billowing upward. They had never seen anything like it. They thought it might be some kind of high-tech thermal shielding or a getaway craft. "They're taking the supplies up," one of the cowboys screamed, redoubling his fire. One cowboy managed to flank the perimeter, sprinting toward a rover with a Molotov cocktail. David intercepted him, tackling the man into the dirt. "Stay down if you want to see tomorrow," David hissed, pinning him. "We aren't here for your land." With the cowboys held at bay by a wall of tactical precision, the balloons were released. They rose silently into the night sky, carrying the crates of Omega dust. Mark grabbed the wide-frequency radio, his voice echoing over every scavenger and survivor frequency. "This is Project Echo. To the survivors of Sioux Falls, to the families in the camps, and to every soul still holding the line in the dark, look up. For 30 years, we have lived in the shadow of a relentless enemy. We have watched the world we built turn into a graveyard. We have hidden in the stone and the steel, waiting for a dawn that never came. Today, that wait ends. We are releasing an agent into the upper atmosphere. It is not a weapon of war. To those of you on the surface, do not flee. Do not fear the haze. Stay indoors, bar your doors, and let the wind work. The era of the biter is over. The silence is finally ending. We are taking our world back." After about 6 minutes, at 5,000 feet, the timers reached 0. A series of muffled thumps echoed across the clouds. To the cowboys below, looking up in confusion and anger at their lost supplies, it looked as though the stars themselves were dissolving. A shimmering white veil of Omega dust began to descend, drifting on the cold prairie wind. Impact in 25 seconds, the comms tech counted down. At 10 seconds, the white streak was visible to the naked eye, a vertical spear of ghost dust piercing the gray clouds. At 20 seconds, the plume began to flare at the bottom, catching the crosswinds and expanding into a massive, shimmering curtain that draped over the city blocks. At 25 seconds, the first concentrated wave hit the pavement. The biters didn't have time to react. The powder hit them with the force of a physical weight. One moment they were mid-stride in that relentless, high-speed walk. The next, they were crumpling into the asphalt as the chemical reaction severed the virus's grip on their nerves. The cowboys lowered their weapons, their faces turned toward the shimmering sky in stunned, silent realization. They hadn't just found a supply cache or a temporary reprieve. As the white dust settled into the cracks of the pavement and the folds of their clothes, they realized they were standing in the middle of the end of the war. Chapter 10: The New Founding. The aftermath of Operation Stardust was not merely a victory, it was a biological reset. The shimmering white veil that had descended from the balloons didn't just kill, it disassembled the very foundation of the 30-year nightmare. In the first 24 hours, Sioux Falls underwent a terrifying transformation. The city, which had hummed with the low-frequency groans and shuffling footsteps of nearly 200,000 biters, fell into an absolute, unnatural silence. As the omega yeast settled, it sought out the viral protein chains like a heat-seeking missile. Under the microscopic level, the predatory yeast attached to the viral shell, secreting an enzyme that broke the molecular bonds holding the necrotic tissue together. The result was a clean slate event. The biters didn't just fall over, they underwent a rapid, sterile decomposition. The virus, which had preserved the corpses in a state of suspended rot for decades, was gone. Within 48 hours, the undead were reduced to inert piles of gray organic matter, essentially high-carbon mulch. The stench of decay, which had defined the city for 30 years, was replaced by a sharp, clean scent of ozone and yeast. David and Mark drove the lead rover into the heart of the city, their tires crunching over the gray remains that littered the asphalt. They wore their tactical respirators, more out of habit than necessity, as they stepped out into the green zone, the downtown district near the old cathedral where the dust had been thickest. The silence was heavy. For the first time in their lives, the steel-born engineers heard the wind whistling through the glass of the skyscrapers without the accompaniment of a predatory moan. "Look at the soil," Mark whispered, kneeling to touch the edge of a sidewalk planter. The omega yeast, having consumed every available viral host, had reached its end state. Deprived of the virus to feed on, the yeast had crystallized and become inert, sinking into the earth as a harmless nutrient. Mara had been in the area when the piece of the ruins was shattered. She heard the sharp, rhythmic cracks of the gunfight, a disciplined, military cadence that stood out against the lawless sounds of the surface. Then came the broadcast. The voice crackling over the radio, combined with the sudden, glowing ascent of the balloons into the evening sky, gave her a heading. She moved like a shadow through the wreckage, staying hidden until the shimmering white haze of the ghost dust finally settled over the city like a heavy, chemical fog. Only when the biters began to hit the pavement did she emerge, closing the distance just enough to observe the men who had brought the winter with them. Standing on the steps of the weathered stone cathedral was a figure that seemed to belong to both the old world and the new. Mara stood with her hood pulled back, her eyes squinting against the unshielded sun. She looked at the rovers, the steel ghosts she had tracked for weeks, and then at the young man in the lead, whose pale skin marked him as someone from the deep dark. Mark approached her tentatively. He saw the bunker's tactical vest hanging loosely off her shoulders, the markings he had studied in the School of Shadows, now covered in surface grit. "You're the saint," David said, his hand hovering near his sidearm, though there was no aggression in his voice. "The one from the radio." Mara didn't answer with words. She stepped forward and slowly pulled back the sleeve of her scavenged jacket. The scar on her forearm was jagged and deep, a clear mark of a high-load viral bite. Any other human would have been a mindless carnivore within an hours of that wound. Instead, the skin was healed, the edges clean and pink. "I breathed your dust," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that had seen too much smoke and too little water. "I waited to die. I waited for the fire to take my mind. But the fire went out." Mark reached out, his gloved fingers trembling as he touched the edge of the scar. This was the ultimate confirmation. His visibility agent, the experiment he thought was a failure, had not only cleared the fungus, it had rewritten the fate of the human race. "It's gone," Mark breathed, looking up at the cathedral spires. "The virus is actually gone." Mara looked at him, at the boy who had accidentally become a legend, and for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. "Not gone," she corrected softly. "Just beaten. Now we have to figure out what to do with the silence." "You're the one," she whispered. "The one who made the dust." The new founding did not mirror the polished history books Mark had studied in the bunker's digital archives. There was no grand constitutional convention, no marble halls, and no sweeping speeches under a reconstructed flag. Instead, the world was rebuilt in the mud, the grease, and the flickering light of salvaged monitors. The birth of the Omega Alliance was a desperate, practical necessity. The survivors on the surface had the numbers, the localized knowledge, and the raw muscle. The Steelborn had the Madison Aquifer's clean water, the geothermal power, and the biological secret to the dust. The Accords were messy because they were built on a foundation of deep-seated distrust. To the surface dwellers, the residents of Project Echo were the Steelborn elitists, the cowards who had hidden in a billion-dollar hole while the rest of the world burned. To the bunker residents, the surface dwellers were ferals, unpredictable, and contaminated. The first trade was simple: 1 gallon of sterile Madison water for every 50 pounds of scrap metal delivered to the bunker's fabrication shop. This evolved into a complex web of VAT leases. Project Echo would provide a localized starter culture of the Omega strain to a settlement, but only if that settlement agreed to follow the biological safety protocols, a rulebook Mark wrote to ensure the yeast wasn't mishandled or lost. Mark's transformation was the most profound. The pale intern who once feared the sun spent the next 15 years as the apostle of the yeast. He lived in a mobile laboratory, a reinforced, solar-powered RV that David's team escorted from the ruins of Chicago to the high-rises of Denver. In each location, the mission was the same: the construction of the vats. Mark would help the locals build massive, jury-rigged fermentation tanks out of old milk silos or brewing equipment. He taught them how to feed the yeast, not with expensive lab nutrients, but with a refined slurry of organic waste and local minerals. Chicago, he watched the Windy City live up to its name as the dust cleared the Magnificent Mile in a single afternoon. Denver, he taught survivors how to use the high altitude to their advantage, letting the mountain winds carry the Omega spores across the Rockies. He wasn't just a scientist, he was a mediator. He had to convince warlords that a dead zone cleared of biters was worth more than a dozen slaves. He had to explain to grieving mothers that the dust wouldn't bring their children back, but it would ensure their grandchildren could walk the grass without fear. It was never a utopia. The Omega strain was a biological predator, and it wasn't long before nefarious factions tried to weaponize it. A group in the remains of St. Louis tried to starve out their rivals by threatening to overseed their crops with a mutated version of the dust, falsely claiming it would kill the plants. It wouldn't, but the fear was enough. Others tried to steal the starter cultures to sell on the black market. David's security teams, the Steel Ghosts, became a traveling police force, protecting the vats from those who saw the cure as just another way to exert power. They faced the purists, a cult-like faction that believed the biters were a divine cleansing and that the Omega Alliance was interfering with God's will. Despite the skirmishes and the lingering prejudices, the fundamental math of the world had changed. For 30 years, the hunger of the biters had been the dominant force on Earth. Now, the hunger of the Omega yeast was faster. By 2055, the steel-born identity was fading. Mark's own children were born in a surface settlement rather than the bunker. They played in the ruins of parks that had been dusted years before. The Alliance wasn't a government, it was a shared heartbeat. It was the realization that while they might never agree on a tax code or a president, they all agreed on the smell of clean air and the sight of a horizon free of the dead. The momentum of life, stubborn, messy, and relentless, had finally become stronger than the momentum of death. Chapter 11. The Ionospheric Bridge. The first signs that the world was still listening came not from satellites, most of which had long since succumbed to orbital decay, but from the high-frequency HF radio bands. In the deepest levels of Project Echo, this signal core worked in a room lined with lead and copper, tuning massive, salvaged shortwave arrays. Because HF radio waves reflect off the Earth's ionosphere, they can travel thousands of miles, skipping over the horizon and across oceans. For 30 years, these bands had been filled with the static of ghosts. But once the Sioux Falls broadcast went live, Mark's voice declaring the end of the biter era, the skip distance carried that message far beyond the Black Hills. 6 months after Operation Stardust, the bunker received its first overseas response. It was a faint, crackling signal in Morse code, originating from a hardened naval installation in Brest, France. Received message. Is dust real? Europe burning. Need Omega. Then came more. A pirate broadcast from a mountaintop observatory in the Andes, a rhythmic, automated pulse from a life raft community in the Tasmanian wilderness, and most surprisingly, a clear, encrypted burst from a subterranean bunker beneath Beijing. The globalization of the cure wasn't driven by diplomacy, but by radio solidarity. Across the planet, the surviving remnants of humanity were huddled around glowing vacuum tubes and hand-cranked receivers. The news of the ghost dust had become a global reflection of hope, leapfrogging across oceans via the ionosphere. The High Council, now expanded to include surface leaders like Mara, faced a daunting ethical dilemma. They had the formula, but they didn't have a navy or a global air force. To save the world, they couldn't just export the dust, they had to export the knowledge. The Alliance developed the Gutenberg Protocol. Mark and his team encoded the genomic sequence of the Omega strain and the blueprints for the fermentation vats into a series of data bursts. We can't fly to London or Tokyo, Mark explained during a global broadcast. But we can give you the recipe. We are sending the starter instructions via slow-skin television, SSDV, and digital packet radio. If you have a vat, if you have the yeast, and if you have the sun, you can clear your own sky. While many nations began building their own Omega vats based on the radio instructions, the Alliance knew that island nations and coastal regions needed a more direct hand. They utilized the last of the global reach assets, 3 salvaged C-130 Hercules aircraft that had been preserved in a dry hangar boneyard in Arizona. The cockpits weren't filled with the young, pale recruits of the bunker. They were manned by the old guard, retired Air Force pilots who had been in their prime when the first spores hit. These were men with weathered hands and memories of a world before the silence, the only ones who still knew the muscle memory of a manual approach. To them, these weren't just missions, they were a final chance to fly for a world that was still breathing. The planes were retrofitted with massive dusting spools. These weren't bombing runs, they were life-giving sorties. The first transoceanic flight, dubbed the Atlantic Bridge, flew from Newfoundland to Ireland, trailing a shimmering white plume of omega yeast that drifted down onto the emerald ruins of Dublin and London. Globalizing the cure brought new dangers. In the Mediterranean, a group of corsair pirates tried to jam the radio frequencies, demanding life tolls from any coastal community that wanted the Omega blueprints. In the Pacific, the Steelborn encountered the Quiet Empire, a faction that had survived on a series of oil rigs and refused to accept the dust, fearing it was a biological Trojan horse designed to finish what the virus started. But the Apostle of the Yeast remained undeterred. Mark spent hours every night on the HF bands, his voice a steady, calm presence in the ears of millions. He became a digital mentor to scientists in Brazil, engineers in South Africa, and doctors in India, guiding them through the delicate horizontal gene transfer via crackling audio. The world was no longer a collection of isolated islands of fear. It was becoming a web of bad cities. The radio waves that had once carried the screams of a dying world were now carrying the blueprints for its resurrection. The ghost dust was no longer American. It was the heritage of a planet that had decided to wake up. By 2058, the 45th anniversary of the descent, the borders of the safe zones covered nearly 60% of the old map. David and Mark stood on the ridge above the Black Hills, looking down at the valley. A new town had been built right over the old entrance to the bunker. The 50-ton blast doors had been removed and melted down to create the frames for the new school and the hospital. Eris died without ever seeing this, Mark said, his hair now streaked with gray. He died in his cell, still waiting for the machines to fail. The machines did fail, David said, leaning on a cane, his eyes fixed on the smoke rising from 100 peaceful chimneys. We just found a better way to stay warm. The sun began to set, casting a long, golden light over the jagged peaks of the Black Hills. The harsh, artificial glare of the bunker's loom cycles was replaced by the warm, living amber of a world in transition. On the steps of the cathedral, the divide between the surface and the deep dark finally began to dissolve. For the first time in nearly half a century, the people weren't ghosts haunted by a dying past or just prey waiting for the end. They were just people, standing together on the threshold of a reclaimed earth.